Welcome to this Vital Health podcast. I'm Duane Schulthess, the CEO of Vital Transformation. Over the past year, Most Favored Nation, or MFN-style drug pricing proposals have resurfaced alongside broader debates about inflation, trade, and domestic capacity. Linking U.S. prices to prices abroad would be a major change, and even the prospect of it can influence planning and expectations across the U.S. pharmaceutical market. In this special edition of the Vital Health podcast, we look back on several important conversations we had in 2025 about the MFN and how this could play out in practice. The opinions expressed are those of the speakers. Up next, we spoke with Kirsten Axelson, a fellow at the Aspen Institute and a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute.
I don't think MFN and the concept of equalizing U.S. and other countries' prices is going away. It's been around with President Trump for a long time, and there was a lot of years to work on it. I think we are likely to see some sort of a CMMI pilot materialize, and I think we're likely to see this continue to be a point of contention in trade talks. If I were being optimistic, I would love to see the points of contention focus more on what is objectionable in the systems as opposed to actually equalizing the price, such as the delay in review times, the amount of time it takes to get a product reimbursed after it's launched in Europe, for example, the clawbacks, which are very hard to manage and unpredictable, budget caps. Those are the kinds of things I think we should be focused on, like the procedural issues, as opposed to just saying we need to get the prices the same. Because frankly, I don't even know how you logistically do that. Like, who goes first? Does Germany price your drug first, and then in the U.S. you agree not to go above that? It's typically been the U.S. first, so I think saying they have to be the same is tricky, whereas focusing on things that are really underappreciating value in drugs is a better policy way to go, although it may not be as emotionally satisfying.
We've released a couple initial studies. We're about to roll out a larger one. And if you look at the numbers related to the 2019 executive order, and if you use that as sort of your base, you find that the country that's most likely to be priced, if you use the basket of countries and then you look for the lowest price in the basket, according to the regulation, it's Luxembourg, and it's 85% lower. You start running the math on what happens to the global ecosystem if you roll out an 85% price reduction, even for the top 50 drugs. You very quickly get to half of the industry revenue. You're literally at 47%. The top 50 drugs are roughly half of the revenue that's generated just from the 50 drugs that you're going to be looking at in the context of Medicare. I mean, it's an enormous hit. It's an absolutely enormous hit. Even if it's just 46% of the market is in Medicare, we calculated 59% in our investment analysis. So if you're looking at 85 times 59, you're basically there. It's 501%. I mean, you're literally at 50%. You're talking millions of jobs lost, 2.6 million jobs. The industry is basically gone. In the model, venture capital drops more than 147% if you just use, a regression and look at the elasticity. I mean, it just gets eviscerated. Given the fact that a company under no circumstances be willing to take hits of that size, trading Luxembourg, a country of less than 1 million people, for the U.S. market of 330 million, isn't there just going to be a domino? Why would you even enter the market? You're just not going to do it.
I think we're far more likely to see loss of access in Europe and Australia, in Japan. Those are big markets, as opposed to companies willing to take that hit on the U.S. market, which is not only a big market, it's a more profitable market relative to other parts of the world. So, we already see very few rare disease drugs launched in Greece, for example. It's not good for global innovation to have the pie get smaller. Ideally, you would like to see the prices come down a bit in the U.S. and go up a bit more in other markets, which I understand is this administration's goal. But again, I don't think you can do that with price controls and price referencing. I really think you have to do that by going after the fundamental problems with some of these price evaluation systems that have either hard budget caps or use measures that are just always going to come down to price that's much lower than the value of the drug, which is why price controls are a pretty tricky idea. And I realize we're probably paying too much for some drugs in the U.S. We're probably paying too little for some drugs in the U.S. But there's not a political or a budgetary focus on those negotiations, and I say negotiations with air quotes, like you would see in markets with centralized price controls.
Let's say you try to do a bona fide negotiation. What power does an individual company have negotiating with a monopsonist government with who has the power of a gun and the power of a purse? I mean, it just seems like you have no leverage at all. This only works if the administration puts this as part of their trade negotiations, which is why it was interesting to hear, at least I've not seen anything written down, but it is fascinating that, okay, we've exempted pharmaceutical tariffs as part of the negotiation. That seems to make sense to me. The other question then in this context is, if a company doesn't put that drug in, you run into WTO issues if you don't utilize those patents. I mean, you can see compulsory licensing. You can see, if you don't use the patent, there's nothing to stop a government saying, hey, we grant you the patent. You're not using it. Great. We're going to take it now. We're going to produce this drug because you're not using the patent. The patent is a gift from society to you. If you don't use it, you can lose it under WTO rules, which, the U.S. and all the countries we've been discussing are members. Is there an awareness of these compulsory licensing regulations and these TRIPS waivers that exist in the World Trade Organization context?
I think no is the short answer. No, I think that hasn't, because, hasn't really happened before. It's a serious thing when a country doesn't get access to life-saving drugs, right? And some countries have been willing to live in that world, and patient assistance and other things step in. But with a policy effect of this size, I don't think patient assistance is going to be able to step in and solve the problems. And so you can only imagine what the retaliation is going to be if we end up in a world where, either because there is a policy change, there is price referencing, or there is so much threat of it that companies just decide it's not worth it to launch in certain countries because of the threat of price referencing.
Yeah, and you mentioned Greece. From 2012 to today, the market has increased. It's doubled, but it's cost 102% of company revenue. In other words, they've given back in real terms 102% to gain the market 100%. They've lost 2% in real terms. That's through clawbacks and rebates and access agreements. So literally, the industry would have been better off sitting there in 2012 at the IMF bailout and going, nah, we're good. We'll just stay where we are now. They would have made the same amount of money. It's bizarre that that's the mechanism that we want to start importing to the United States. I don't think people get how this actually works.
No, you see the hearings, member of Congress holds up the price in Japan, holds up the price in Germany and says, it's lower. Well, for example, we watch the GLP-1 drug hearings, like, oh, look at the price in Germany, look at the price in the UK. Well, it's not reimbursed in those systems.
Yeah.
Or in the UK it is, but you have to see an obesity specialist, and there's very few of those. So getting lower prices comes at a cost, and that cost is typically getting access to that medicine. And I think because we're in a world where there's a lot of information, we aren't all experts in every industry. I would say when I read the newspaper, I know if it's misleading in terms of healthcare. I don't know if it's misleading in terms of almost any other topic. And so, of course, people don't appreciate that those countries aren't just getting $200 cancer drugs. Anybody who wants one of them can have one.
One of the other things in the executive order around most favored nations, it punts a lot of the decision-making to HHS, Health and Human Services. Are we potentially running afoul, given the fact that Chevron deference was overturned in the Supreme Court, the idea that you can just punt things to a division and then they're going to make the law like whole cloth? How do they get around the fact that that would likely run afoul of the fact that you can't do that anymore, at least according to the Supreme Court? Does this then just have to park as a demonstration project, and then isn't it going to be much more limited by definition?
It could be, and I can't pretend to be a legal expert at all. I have heard, and I'll repeat what I've heard, that I think the process of making new laws is going to leave less open to interpretation. Much more has to get decided up front, which is both good and bad, right? One of the things that's been good about the implementation, for example, of the Medicare Modernization Act is, things have evolved over time, both through changes in law and in regulation, some for the better, some for the worse. But yeah, if it becomes that, CMS is not allowed to interpret and implement things, we could be in a world where we're just doing infinite pilots, which a lot of these pilots don't save money. don't endure. So I'm not sure that Infinite Pilots is a great world to be in either.
But it's a great name for a band.
It's a great name for a band.
I've just pulled, in the context of the research we're doing on MFN, I've pulled a bunch of data on Chinese clinical trials because there's increasingly awareness that more and more drugs and INDs, investigational new drugs and applications are coming from Chinese companies themselves going into the FDA. According to our research and looking at the numbers, China now is producing more clinical trials registered with FDA than Europe, and that includes Switzerland and the UK. And at current growth rates, the U.S. is growing about 2.53% per year in aggregate clinical trials. China is growing 25%, which means by 2029, China will be more visible in clinical trials and have a bigger footprint than the United States and the FDA. Arthur Damage from Harvard mentioned in his 2007 study that Europe in 1980 produced 60% of all medicines. Then in 2004, they put in the centralized procedure. They put in very aggressive HTA requirements. The U.S. did the prescription drug benefit and Medicare Part D, and we saw an enormous incentive in transition to the United States and leadership. Is the United States running the risk of doing to ourselves what Europe did to itself 20 years ago and sort of handing the football, whether they mean it or not, to China? Is this where we're going?
I think absolutely right. The U.S. built a huge amount of leadership in clinical trial and drug development for a couple of reasons, right? Educated population, facilities, and the ability to conduct clinical trials, and a profitable market. And whenever possible, it's good to test drugs in your best, most profitable market, because then you get some experience and understanding with the physicians who are later going to prescribe that drug. Now, China doesn't have a particularly profitable market or a high reward in terms of the prices they offer. But what the government of China has done is over decades made a concerted effort to make it a very hospitable market for drug development and clinical trials. You have population willing to enroll in clinical trials. You have the facilities. You have increasing trust. Of course, there's still concerns. And you have, an educated population. And you've also seen sort of initial efforts to protect intellectual property, allow technology transfer so universities can reap some of the benefits of the research they're doing, and the world has followed, right? We're seeing tons of deals done with multinational pharma companies, and it used to be that China developed sort of like the follow-on drugs, the knockoff drugs. Now China's developing drugs for cancer. Even if it's a follow-on drug for cancer, that's, they're still going to be profitable. So, while the U.S. is now increasingly eroding its ability to have the science and the innovative space to conduct clinical trials, China has really grabbed the opportunity. And I think if it continues to get harder to get reimbursed in the U.S., which has traditionally been the market that kind of held up the whole industry, multinational companies are going to be looking for less expensive places to do their drug development. And right now, China is a pretty great option for that.
Up next, we spoke with Patrick Kelly, Chief Advocacy Officer at the Healthcare Distribution Alliance. So, the Trump administration is going to be announcing, or at least rolling out, most favored nations. Now, the concept of most favored nations is that if a price is offered anywhere outside of the U.S., ex-U.S., it has to be provided here as well at the same price. Now, we calculate, looking at our numbers, and this is mostly dealing with branded medicines, of course, but, we're seeing that Luxembourg, Netherlands, Norway, South Korea, somewhere in there is about 80% lower on gross price than it is in the U.S. Now, we've been speaking mostly about generics, but there's still 10% of the volume that your members deal with that are branded. And these will be injectable oncology products. These will be perishable or at least highly volatile gene therapy, stem cell therapy, some things with very difficult supply chain. You're buying those now at a price that is currently set. What happens if you're warehousing this stuff and MFN gets announced and suddenly everything you have on your books under contract drops by 60, 70% in price? What happens?
The expectation, as I said earlier, every contract I think we have has price depreciation provisions that say if a price drops, you will provide the lower price or we will invalidate the contract. So if that does happen and all of a sudden a price drops substantially, I think we would have to provide access to the lower price. But then we're in a position where we've purchased inventory at the non-MFN price.
Right.
Let's say it's a $10,000 oncolytic and the price drops in an MFN scenario. If it's 80%, we're dropping down to $2,000 in that.
Yeah, there's an $8,000 eat there somewhere.
Right. So I think the expectation would be that the manufacturer would make us whole on the existing inventory we have because it's through no fault of our own. That's wishful thinking. Or the manufacturer could say, hey,
sorry
guys,
this is not our problem.
This is your federal government imposing this on us, and we had nothing to do with it, and we're doing it under full duress. Or if they could just say we're not going to participate in the various programs and say we're not going to abide by that 80% reduction in price. We'll get out of the Medicare program. We'll get out of the Medicaid program. We'll get out of VA. We'll get out of all the various, mandated government programs. And that may happen. Again, this is where the manufacturers are privy to all of these negotiations with the government at this point in time with the administration. I'm not sure how they're going to react. And I don't. In some cases, an 80% reduction, although we saw today, Bristol Myers Squibb is going to basically provide one of their products, I believe it's an eczema drug, at 80% off the list price and through a direct consumer program, which is the other thing that the administration is pushing. But they've reduced their price 80%. Now they're taking a $6,000 eczema medicine, $6,000 a month, and they're dropping it to $900 and I think $52 a month for cash pay. I don't know if there's anybody out there that doesn't have insurance that would go to a cash pay that can afford $900 a month in addition to putting groceries on the table, paying for gas, rent, mortgage, etc. That doesn't seem like an attainable product at $900 a month. Now, if it drops to $90 a month, that's a different story. But even a significant discount like that, trying to basically prop it up through a direct consumer pathway presents a challenge.
It's one thing to offer a price. There was also a big announcement that BMS, again, not to pick on BMS, but they'd said we've announced a drug here in the U.S. and we're forcefully putting it at the same price in the U.K. I live in Belgium. I've been working health economics in Europe for close to 20 years now. I think many companies introduce a price, a high price. Where does it end up? Do they get that price through the negotiation with the NHS in the UK? No, they don't. I think it's one thing to announce it. It's another thing to actually get the cash in hand. And I think that's the problem. A $900 price is still a pretty hefty price.
Yeah. To that point, it's like when the president announced the recent executive order, this was May 12th, the executive order on most favored nation pricing. The concept there is like we pay more than every other country in the world for products. That's unfair that the rest of the developed nations, in particular the OECD countries, have free-ridden on U.S. innovation and basically left the U.S. patients to basically subsidize all research and development due to the price points we pay in the United States that nobody else in the world pays. That's a very valid point. And again, when you have single-payer markets out there where you can just dictate pricing and terms, you can control that. We don't have a single-payer system in this country, and I think the reason we don't is why all the innovation in medical technology, at least for the last 50 years, has taken place in the United States. That may be changing. The president's suggestion during the press conference was, okay, if that's true, and which it is, I would want our industry to essentially increase the prices that they're selling product for overseas, and whatever increase they're able to get is to reduce the cost
price in the U.S.
the U.S. accordingly, which I think everybody would embrace, and I think the pharmaceutical industry would embrace that. But the reality is you are not going to get foreign governments, national health system, anybody in Europe to basically agree to willingly pay more if they control the marketplace, and that's the challenge. And I think Eli Lilly said starting in September 1, they were going to basically say, we're going to tell all of our European market or our developed country marketplaces that we're going to basically raise the prices. Whether we're successful in that or not, or whether we have to say we're no longer going to sell product, and this is a very difficult proposition for these manufacturers to make, we're just no longer going to sell product in that country because they're not willing to pay the fair price.
Boy, there's a lot there to dig into, Patrick. The problem with that, if you look at what the European Commission and the European Medicines Agency is currently doing, and it would appear to be in preparation for this occurrence, what you're talking about now, where companies in the U.S., their hand is being forced to say, okay, sorry, you got to ante up. We want this 3 or 4 times higher now. And the problem is you have the compulsory licensing in the World Trade Organization, and the European Commission is now trying to rationalize the compulsory licensing arrangements at the EU level, not the member state level. So they're trying to push through a rationalization of that legislation. And what we think at our firm is to have a one-stop shop. Okay, fine. Then you don't provide it. You don't give us a price. Basta. You're not using your intellectual property. We're applying a compulsory license on the WTO rules.
And again, the risk they take.
It is the risk they take. And again, looking back at this price differential, which has emerged basically since 2003 with the onset of the Medicare prescription drug benefit in Part D, which was passed in 2004, what you see is in 1980, according to Arthur Damrich at Harvard, some research he's done, which I like to quote, 80%, well, 70% of global pharmaceuticals were based in Europe, 68%. Now it's completely flipped. At least it was until a couple of years ago. But now what we're seeing in our data, the U.S. is starting to surrender that leadership to China. And we're seeing enormous exponential growth in Chinese-led companies filing clinical trial data in the FDA. And it's currently, as of today, it's past Europe, and it's trending in 2028 if things don't change to overtake the U.S. in 2028. Is there an awareness of this? I mean, obviously, you're downstream from a lot of these discussions, Patrick, but you sit at the hot seat because you're a price taker here. You're stuck. You don't have much leverage. Is there an awareness of what's going on with?
Yeah, so I think there's a growing awareness. I don't think there's universal awareness of that. But again, we go back to this national security exposure that is a major driver of policy coming out of this administration. China is one of the entities that I think presents the most concern with regard to their past history and maybe some of their aspirational economic and or geopolitical desires moving forward, but we need to be cognizant of that. And if our leadership position on anything, on semiconductor chips, AI, pharmaceutical production, clinical trials, is threatened by China, we should be sitting up to take notice.
Up next, we spoke with John Murphy, President and CEO of the Association for Accessible Medicines. Yesterday, the Trump administration made an announcement with Pfizer that they would be pursuing an agreement under most favored nations. Pfizer is going to offer the same price in the U.S. in Medicaid as it has internationally for the price they provide abroad. John, what are the broader implications for most favored nations given the statute of the agreement, at least as it's been announced?
I approach, as representing the generic industry, most favored nation, similar to the way I approached IRA, which is to say a competitive market is a better solution to lowering costs than the government simply deciding what it's going to pay. On the one hand, that's really important for us to have as a level set, because I don't think Medicare most favored nation is going to get us magically to a place where drug prices are more affordable for the patient when they actually go pick it up. And I watched the president speak yesterday. I watched Albert Bourla speak yesterday. I've looked at the press. Unfortunately, I can't help but take away a little bit from this of seeing this expansion of direct-to-consumer pricing for brand drugs, this access to cash pay, to saying, I guess we're giving up on fixing the patient experience with its insurance company. Is that really where we're going? Because I find it hard to believe. And by the way, I'm not knocking what Pfizer's doing. What I'm kind of looking at this and I'm saying, I'm in the process, because I run a company now, I just got all the insurance information for what AAM's health plan is going to look like next year.
Premiums went up, right, John? Premiums went up.
The best we're doing is we're saying my premiums are going to go up 18% for AAM's employees next year. If we don't pass ACA subsidy reform, premiums are going to go up 28 to 30% for a lot of people in the exchanges that have subsidies. And by the way, we're kind of moving to a model where if you need a brand drug, you can actually just pay cash for it on this website. So what's the purpose of insurance having a prescription drug benefit at that point? And by the way, I look at some of the rates that are starting to be charged by some of these brand manufacturers, and they are significant discounts. But to the average American, $3,800 a month, like they're supposed to be having insurance that pays for that. And so I am a little bit dissatisfied as a consumer in the fact that you watch this and I say, we have to address the Medicaid issue. The 340B issue is a complete disaster. And it was good for Pfizer to focus on that. And the solution isn't to just make these products available direct to consumer for cash. We all owe more of a discussion about insurance reform. It's a positive to see the administration saying tacitly, we do want to address the fact that we pay more for a lot of drugs in the US than the Europeans do. How we get to fixing that is probably not going to be easy. It's certainly not going to be by just having government mandated price controls. And so it was good to see that we seem to be moving away from that based on the announcement yesterday. My anticipation, there'll be a couple of other companies that come in and announce that. We're seeing a more moderative effect to the tariff environment in the pharma space, which is also a net positive for American patients. I just can't help but have this nagging concern that we're going to see a big direct-to-consumer push on a lot of expensive medicines, and then the government's going to say, we did our job. We don't have to do anything else.
Yeah. Does Trump RX become Newsom RX or Vance RX in the next election?
Well, that's what I don't know, right? And we have this model, like Mark Cuban's been running cost plus drugs for a while now. And I think if you talk to him, he would explain to you that part of the reason they predominantly sell older commoditized generics is because that's basically what people can afford from a cash perspective, right? You don't see them in very complex molecule products trying to sell at cost plus drugs because that's the purpose of having insurance. You're supposed to be using your insurance for that. Mark and their CEO, whose name I'm forgetting now, they're starting to move into their own single line PBM business because they also realize that if they want to grow that business, they actually have to be working with insurers to actually cover that cost.
Yeah, and part of the problem, what I've always mentioned to people when they bring up the Mark Cuban cost plus drugs, is they don't have to pay for people going up and into Medicare. They don't have to run a Medicare Advantage insurance plan that then covers people at the most expensive part of the value chain. They get to deal with people under 50, 55, 60 before they retire. Hey, that's
Exactly.
great. We're all pretty cheap before we hit 65. That's the reality.
Yeah. And to add to that, Duane, and I had one of my board members, large generic company CEO, say to me, the other value that Cost Plus has, they get to pick what drugs they want to sell. Right. Like if you're running a large multi-portfolio generic company, you've got drugs that actually lose money, drugs that break even, and drugs that are profitable, and you have to make that mix work. In a Cost Plus drug scenario, you can be kind of scrupulous in what you offer based upon what you're able to extract from a value standpoint, what you're able to sell it for. And so it's a little bit less complicated than trying to sell Pen-G derivative antibiotics in the U.S. market, and we want to pay 12 cents for them.
And this gets to a core problem we've touched on a lot in this conversation so far, and that is what makes good politics or good PR often is really contrary to the nuts and bolts of the legislation. And it is horribly complex, John. You, more than anyone, knows that. I mean, you dealt with the first Trump executive order in Most Favored Nations. You actually were one of the lead court lawyers that took the case to federal court. You're intimately acquainted with that legislation, and obviously we played a part in that because we provided the economic analysis that was part of the filing. I guess what's interesting is we're dealing now with a sort of new, improved MFN and Part 2 and 3D or whatever. This is supposedly scoped only to Medicaid. The law that was initially passed in 2019 that you and I were involved in, that was specifically related to Part B, 50 drugs in Part B. We've got Medicaid walled off now in this. Are you concerned that there's going to be mission creep here? What's to stop it from dialing up into Medicare?
That's always been a concern of mine. The government has the most leverage in the Medicare market.
Absolutely.
Because it's the largest population, it's the largest spend, it has the highest need for medication. And that was, why then Secretary Alex Azar targeted that, because they saw that was the most potential for savings for the government if everything were to work well. I do worry about the broader implications of these deals in Medicare, but it strikes me that if the brand manufacturers continue to keep the initiative of making positive adjustments, it seems to me like the administration's open to that as opposed to having a more heavy-handed approach, because they like the ability to have a headline to say we're actually really doing something for patients. I'm a little nervous, though, Duane, candidly, because I look at the deal that was announced, and if I'm the average patient going to the pharmacy counter, I have no idea if they're going to see any effect. That's the voter question as we go into 2026. We're going to have a pretty acrimonious midterm election season. I don't know what you're going to show to voters in terms of actually reducing their costs, because you haven't addressed the PBM conundrum. We haven't addressed the fact that it takes 3 years on average for a new generic medicine to get covered by the Part D program after it's approved for FDA. We're seeing this like longer and longer delay to get competitive medicines to the market. And what does it really mean for a patient who takes 2, 3, 4 medicines in the Medicare market if they're seeing these headlines, but every month they're going to the pharmacy and nothing's changing?
Part of the concern here is the reason why they've gotten, I don't want to say a sweetheart deal, that's a bit cynical, but there's a real deal there. But part of the reason why Pfizer did it, admittedly by their own, what they said during the press conference, was they're breaking ground on a new facility to manufacture and avoid tariffs. Now, we've brought up the issue of tariffing here in this conversation. In our post-COVID world, there's a desire and an interest to reshore much manufacturing for security reasons and also for supply reasons, as we discussed with Baxter, but there's also this horrible pricing pressure to lower the cost of medicines. Is it going to be possible to both onshore and lower prices and guarantee supply with the fact that you have these insane thin margins on a lot of these products? Something's got to give here, right?
What do we used to talk about in the old manufacturing game? Right?
Good, faster, cheap.
Good, faster,
Pick any
cheap.
two.
Yeah. The thing is, like, we also have to start from a basis, and we've been doing this with the administration, of understanding where we are, right? 60-ish% of the finished fill capacity of generic drugs used in the United States are finished and filled in the United States. Now, they use imported API or imported KSM, but like we actually have a lot of capacity. And actually, we have a ton of dormant capacity for finished fill in the US because people have been shuttering plants because it's unprofitable to make a lot of that stuff here. The capacity exists. Now, the question becomes, earlier in the supply chain, the API manufacturing and the KSM mining, is it realistic to think of a world where 100% of that is onshored in the United States? In early 2000, if you look at USP's data, the US and the European Union collectively produced about 60% of the API we needed for the generic supply chain. Today, we produce about 12%. There's a couple of reasons for that. One, to your point, we wanted it cheaper, and we had to find cheaper places to produce. There's a little bit of a not so fun part of that to talk about, which is to say API manufacturing is high output chemical manufacturing. And a lot of states decided they don't want chemical manufacturing facilities in their backyards. And they've passed a number of regulations, California, even Texas, Florida, that really sort of make it very challenging to do that historically kind of dirty, kind of smelly, and not smelly in a pollutive standpoint, but it has an odor of manufacturing. And we sort of didn't want that here. India, for example, said, well, we have a lot of people that we need to provide jobs to, and we could do that here. And in many cases, we can do it very high quality, and it doesn't cost as much. We are seeing a lot of interest in the generic space to trying to make strategic investments in the United States, where we can make the math work. Hikma Pharmaceuticals, a good example, has just announced a $1 billion increase in their sterile injectable manufacturing in the US. Sterile injectable is an area where I think we could do more, right? And oral medicines as well, because shipping liquids from India costs a lot of money. It's actually cheaper in many cases to just make it here. There are targeted opportunities. One of the things that we talked to the administration about, though, is you hear a lot of acrimony from some of the folks in the Buy America program. They say it's like the only reason they make it in India is because they subsidize it and it's not fair. We could subsidize things here too. The European Union is in the process of working on some subsidy programs to increase antibiotic production in the United States. That's a real opportunity for us here as well. There is no fermentation capacity anywhere in the United States to make things like cephalosporin. It's all coming from overseas. And I think we want to have some capacity to make that here. But if we're going to continue to only reimburse those products at sub $1, it's $100 million, $200 million, several billion dollars, depending on the scale, to build that. And you have to build it new because there's nothing that exists here. How do we make that math work in a way that a board of directors doesn't laugh you out of the room when you say, I need $1 billion to build this? And by the way, my return horizon is 50 years.
Yeah.
Because of what I can get reimbursed. We have to fix the economics. And I think the administration's they have actually been very pragmatic in their conversations with us. They understand this is a problem. They actually want to figure out ways to fix it. Could we do preference for Buy America? You saw that in the recent executive order on the API stockpiling mandate. They're supposed to preference American manufacturing. Now, I don't think that's enough, but I think it's a step in the right direction.
Up next, we spoke with Joe Hamming, U.S. Business Director at Vital Transformation, and Harry Bowen, Consulting Economist at Vital Transformation. The Trump administration has an agreement in hand with Pfizer for most favored nations drug pricing in Medicaid. What is most favored nations drug pricing? Harry, I'm going to start with you. What is most favored nations?
Most favored nation drug pricing is to pick out a country within a certain distance from the U.S. GDP, and then to look at the price that is being charged for a particular drug or an average basket of drugs, and then to say that our prices in the United States are much greater than in most favored nation that we've picked, and we need to lower our drug prices to that level, or alternatively have the foreign most favored nation raised their drug prices to our level. So basically, we're trying to level the field with regard to the price that's being charged to U.S. consumers in the U.S. market.
So, Joe, given what we've just heard from Harry, if we go back to, say, the year 2000, 2004, somewhere in there where the Medicare Part D prescription drug benefit was passed, the bell cow for expensive drugs was Lipitor, which was a Pfizer product. Now, what's the history of that product, and how was pricing when you folks grabbed up Lipitor from Warner Lambert when you made that acquisition?
Well, in the early 2000s, we were fighting the perception of this horrifically expensive medicine, Lipitor, which was in the United States was $600 to $800 a year. By the standards today, that seems like a very, very low price. Prices throughout Europe and the rest of the world were very comparable at that point. But what has happened since is now that Lipitor and the other statins are off patent, the price has dropped to essentially free. It's pennies per pill. So the comparison at the time was very much even with the US and the rest of the world. But that ushered in a period of incredible innovation in many products and a lot of biologic products, which are very expensive. The cost of goods is very high. It's an apples and oranges comparison when you think of the 2000s, early 2000s to today, because again, we didn't have those incredibly expensive products like we do today.
So, Harry, we've just released 2 Most Favored Nation studies. The most recent was focused on Medicare. If you look at those impacts of a theoretical Most Favored Nation rollout where we price on the lowest country in the basket, what are the impacts of that? Top line, what do we see as happening?
So we looked at the top 50 drugs in Medicare, B, D. We also went into Medicaid. The bottom line was that was a loss of a little over 2 million jobs. That represents about 40% of the current U.S. jobs in the biopharmaceutical industry. Of course, the knock-on effect of that is the government loses tax revenue. So we also calculated that over a 10-year period from 25 to 34, that we'd lose about $600 billion in federal tax revenue and about $450 billion in state tax. And if you look at that as a fraction of GDP, we calculated under the best guess idea of what price reductions would be that we'd get a loss of about 1.8% of U.S. GDP, which is $27 trillion, under a less stringent price reduction, which basically is about half. These are not small numbers.
No.
They are huge numbers.
You know, Steve Usden at BioCentury just wrote a great article about this, highlighting that Pfizer has negotiated in Medicaid, not Medicare. So we'd heard initially this summer that it was going to be Medicaid. Then the Trump administration came out and said it's going to be Medicare. And then it turns out the deal is, in fact, Medicaid. That actually drops the impacts by about a little less than half. It's about roughly 1 million jobs and 775,000 jobs, about $1 trillion of impact. I mean, again, devastating, really bad. Is this going to have a uniform impact? Pfizer said, hey, we're just going to do Medicaid. How does this work compared to some of the other firms out there?
None of these huge policy prescriptions, if you will, are even across the board. They all have different impacts depending on the company's size, its portfolio, whether it has a very heavy Medicaid population, like some that we've spoken about recently. It is not an even impact across the various biopharmaceutical companies. It's quite the opposite, actually.
So if we look at, say, a company like Vertex that deals mostly in cystic fibrosis, there's a lot of poor kids that have cystic fibrosis. One would think that Vertex would be over-indexed in this and be probably quite impacted.
One would think. We haven't run all those particular numbers, of course, but Vertex isn't alone. There are going to be many, many, many companies that cater to these populations that are going to be hit very hard if this were to be implemented across the board.
Duchenne muscular dystrophy,
Right.
That's another one.
Right.
Again, it doesn't matter if you're rich or poor. This is something where you need a treatment. It's an orphan drug. It's going to be expensive, and a lot of that is going to be in Medicaid. We're celebrating something here without really thinking of the third and fourth level impacts. given past history and what we've seen when things get implemented at the federal level, I mean, I've been assured by Woodrow Wilson that federal income tax is temporary until World War I is over. So I'm waiting for that to be rescinded.
I didn't know you knew him.
Personally, well, I know him every year when I pay my taxes, Joe, definitely. Harry, the question is, do we honestly think this is going to stay in Medicaid, or does this dial get twisted?
These huge sweeping ideas in terms of what they're trying to do, I just think that we're going about constructing a whole potential disaster infrastructure around the idea of lowering drug prices, price controls, let's call them what they are. There's such a scope to screw things up.
Is that a technical economic term?
That is. It's called you're effed. And the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah.
And I think this is a good example of that. A lot of this is they don't really know what to do. They'd really like to do something because politically that's what they would like to do. But I think they also know that they're really going to screw things up. Somebody is thinking hopefully beyond step one and saying, this might look good on paper today, but 3 months down the road, when those insurance premiums go through the roof, which is now what we're seeing in terms of shutdowns and all that, and we had predicted that in terms of earlier work. I mean, there are just these god-awful unintended consequences that come out of that nobody is going to be happy. The American public is not going to be happy when their insurance premiums quadruple.
Which we're starting to see.
Yeah.
I mean, it's 20% to 36%, depending on where you're at right now. Let's go scorched earth on this. Let's say somebody, now that we've put in MFN, the problem is this mechanism doesn't disappear. Let's say the Trump administration, obviously they dialed this back and they said, okay, we're going into Medicaid. Let's say Europe says, no, we're not going to do this. And let's say the prices disperse and go down and we have this 80% price dispersion. What happens if we start pushing prices down 60, 70% in the U.S.?
The received wisdom is that the biopharmaceutical industry is so over profitable and it just rakes in money that they can take whatever is dished out. We have already seen over the last couple of years significant changes in the way that the industry is looking at early investments, for instance. There's nothing more popular to the average American than hearing that drug prices are going to be slashed. But with that popular message of let's slash prices, let's make it fair across the board, that is throughout the world, what is to stop this from creeping into the Medicare market and other markets? I don't think there's anything to stop that. And I'd like to refer to the excellent conversation that you had with John Murphy from Association for Accessible Medicines. He made a really wonderful point. John's point was that this administration is very, very interested in learning about the market and is trying to figure it out. I was very pleased to hear him say that the administration is willing to listen and willing to learn. But what we need to do as an industry is to continue to show what the consequences will be if these types of policy prescriptions continue to creep into other existing markets. I don't think anybody's trying to break the system, but it's very close to being broken if there isn't some careful analysis of what we can expect in the future.
If we look at some of the reactions, say what's been going on in Europe, for example, this is a press release dated May 21st, 2025 from the European Commission. I'm just going to read the headline here. European Commission welcomes political agreement on compulsory licensing to enhance EU crisis resilience. Let's unwind that Orwellian speak here a little bit. What does this mean? Compulsory licensing used to be a member state competence, so that would have to be put in the 27 member states. The EU has just put together a reconciled package that allows a one-stop shop to do a compulsory license EU-wide. Now, why would they do that right now, Harry? Why would the EU be wanting to be focused on being able to make it really easy to compulsory license, which means, i.e., we're going to take your patent and then give it to someone else? Why would that happen?
Well, if the U.S. U.S. demands that the drug prices in Europe go up and the Europeans balk at that, they can always compulsory license.
If the company doesn't utilize their
If
patents.
the company doesn't utilize its patents, it can be compulsory license. This is a disaster for the companies. I think car prices are too expensive.
Yeah.
Why don't we get car prices down? Let's, those BMWs and Mercedes are a lot cheaper in Europe than they are over here. And I think we should have those. Just a little levity there, but hopefully showing the idiocy of all this.
There was just an announcement that one of our clients is going to make sure, and it was a very splashy announcement about 3 weeks ago, that the drug price that they're putting here in the U.S. is the same price that they're rolling out in the U.K. And as I pointed out, that's great. You can announce a price in the U.K. Now, are you going to get that price with the NHS? Probably not.
When you think about just the example of Merck a little over a month ago making that big decision, the huge withdrawal from the UK. I mean, this is not because things are great. This is because there's a lack of appreciation and understanding of what it takes to develop medicines, and they're going to move to the United States. My fear is we have the opportunity here in the United States to attract an enormous amount of investment. At the very time that we are winning, we're ready to fritter that away. I don't get it. We could very easily lose our edge. We're in very serious danger of fumbling the future here.
If you go back 2018, Chinese-based companies were doing about 100 clinical trials. If you look at this year, it's gone up one full order of magnitude. There are 1,000 trials in 2025 being filed with the FDA. These are Chinese-run trials, Chinese companies filing in the FDA. They've now gone past Europe in the league table. They're actually producing more clinical research than European companies, and at current trend, they're going to eclipse the United States by 2028, according to our projections.
China is going to swamp us if we're not careful. We're doing exactly the wrong thing.
Well, I would say, competition is healthy.
Sure.
In that sense, we welcome that competition, let's say, from China. The problem is we're shooting ourselves in the foot. And these policies are just moving us closer to shooting ourselves in the leg and finally in the rear end and pretty soon in the head. And that's really the problem. We're killing ourselves. We still are competitive at the moment, but we're slowly slipping down that very steep slope. It's very disconcerting.
If you go back and look at the data on biotech creation, this is just 5 years ago, 2020, 2019, you see that Europe was producing 40%, US was producing 60% of biotechs. Now, that's 5 years ago. You look at that now, it's 20% on either end has completely disappeared, and that's just in 5 years. My point is this goes away pretty darn fast. There was a story we saw in Stat that Peter Kolchinsky, the very famous venture capitalist that we've collaborated with and worked with a bit, Peter had shut down one of his venture funds and relocated it to China. Picking up on most favored nations, this is not the first time this has occurred. The Trump administration had put in something under an executive order under Medicare Part D as a demonstration project. It doesn't seem like there's going to be a lawsuit here. I don't think the companies are going to try the same legal approach that they did last time. Do you think they're just going to go in and say, okay, we're going to negotiate individual by individual company?
The honest answer is I don't know. It seems as though this is becoming a sort of a one-off situation. That is the way that the Trump administration is happy to do things. Companies are making lots of interesting one-off decisions to increase their manufacturing capacity in the United States to avoid tariffs, for instance. I don't see the same appetite for that kind of action at this point.
So we've got pricing pressure being put on Medicaid. We've got tariffs being threatened somewhere between 15 and 100%. We've got a request to onshore manufacturing, but we also want drug prices lower. Harry, does all this work? Can we do all that?
Yes and no.
You economist, you.
All these things, it creates a kind of confusion. Trump is following the divide and conquer rule. So, as you mentioned, he's negotiating individually with the drug companies, doesn't want to talk to the pharma organization that represents collectively drug companies. And a lot of that just has to do with the idea of bargaining power and negotiation. If you go for an individual company, The bargaining power of an individual company is less than a group of companies. So if they all collectively said, okay, we will do this, if not that, then they're just a bigger element. So they have more bargaining power in that sense. You want to try to minimize the amount of leverage that the other party has. That just gives you more leverage. It may also be partly a political kind of thing. If they can get a major drug company to announce that they're doing something, okay, we've done that. Now let's move on to all this other stuff that we're trying to do. This all comes in small waves. They're important, but they're small waves. It's not like a huge tsunami legislation that's coming in. Trump tends to send off these bottle rockets every now and then. Bottle rocket goes off, here's this big splashy thing, and then a week later you don't really hear much about it anymore. So a lot of it is just kind of wait and see. It's kind of like been with the tariffs. 100% tariffs on China, and then, okay, now we negotiate it to this, and it's just part of a strategy. But certainly in a political sense, I don't think it's the usual game.
Yeah, but we had 3.8% GDP growth last quarter, which puts us one of the fastest growing economies on the planet. Yet hiring is scaloric. There's nothing there.
You know, a lot of this is supply driven, right?
Yeah.
I mean, we are losing a lot of the labor force. Demand seems to be sufficient to be absorbing a reduced labor force. Everybody is a bit confused by this, to tell you the truth.
You know, pharma and bio were always the 500-pound gorillas on the block as far as DC lobbying. It's kind of amazing that we're now in a situation where they've been blocked out of the MFN negotiation. Did you ever kind of see this? Would this have ever happened?
I can't imagine it ever happening, but here we are. It goes to the art of the deal, the divide and conquer strategy. Why negotiate with a trade organization if you can go to individual CEOs and get a deal? Then it allows you to go to the next company and the next company, and with the expectations that things fall into place.
Our editor is Mark Brodeen. Our project manager is Caden Drake. The Vital Health Podcast is a production of Vital Transformation, LLC, copyright 2025.